All right, so we're kicking off the new year with a deep dive. And you know me, I love getting into the nitty-gritty of things. So we're doing something a little different today. We're going straight to the source. We've got a whole stack of New Year's addresses. From world leaders, no less. Every corner of the globe. Asia, Europe, Africa, the Americas, the Middle East. It's like getting a personal briefing from presidents and prime ministers. And let me tell you, it's fascinating to see what they're focused on. What's keeping them up at night, you know?
It really is a unique glimpse into their priorities, and
Mm.
I think it often reveals a lot about the global landscape as a whole, the shared anxieties,
Yeah.
emerging trends, the issues that are likely to dominate the headlines in the coming year.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. One thing that really jumped out at me was the emphasis on economic maneuvering, even from the big players. China, for example. Their GDP is already a mind-boggling $17.8 trillion. But President Xi Jinping, he's not just patting himself on the back. He's outlining these proactive policies, things like flexible monetary measures, increased bond issuance. What's the strategy there?
It's a balancing act. Really, on the surface, China's economy seems unstoppable, right? But they're grappling with some significant internal challenges, like that real estate downturn that's been making headlines. So these new policies, there's much about stimulating growth as they are about preventing a full-blown crisis. And you have to remember, a hiccup in China's economy sends shockwaves through the entire world.
Right, so it's not just about China, it's about global stability. And they're not alone, are they? Japan's Prime Minister Kishida, Germany's Chancellor Scholz. They're also talking about navigating economic recovery, inflation, and of course the ongoing energy transition.
Absolutely. Each country has its own unique context, of course. But what's striking is the common thread. They're all trying to thread the needle, so to speak, stimulating growth while keeping inflation in check. And then there's the energy transition, moving away from fossil fuels. That has massive economic implications. It's a high-stakes juggling act, for sure.
Speaking of high stakes, let's talk about the elephant in the room. These calls for unity, or at least the appearance of it. France's President Macron, he's trying to rally support after dissolving parliament, while President Putin in Russia is framing their situation, especially the war in Ukraine, as a moment that demands national strength. Is this just rhetoric? Or is there something deeper going on here?
I'd say it's both,
Yeah.
actually. On one level, it's classic political strategy.
Right.
Using these addresses to control the narrative. Macron needs to project optimism to get things done, while Putin relies on this image of historical resilience. But I think it also reflects a genuine need for internal cohesion, especially in times of crisis.
So unity as a tool for leadership, but also maybe a reflection of how fragile things feel right now. And it's not just about internal unity, is it? Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te, he's emphasizing their international role, calling for recognition on the global stage.
That's a really interesting point. Taiwan's in a unique position, facing these very specific geopolitical pressures. So by emphasizing their contributions, their global engagement, they're trying to solidify their standing in the world. It's unity with a purpose, you could say, rallying international support amidst a very complex global landscape.
All right, let's shift gears a bit from economic anxieties and political maneuvering to something that feels a bit more boots on the ground, security. Senegal's President Sall made a pretty bold statement. They're closing all foreign military bases in 2025. That sounds like a power move.
It absolutely is. It sends a very clear message. Senegal is asserting its sovereignty and rejecting external influence, particularly when it comes to military presence. It's a stark contrast to Japan, where Prime Minister Kishida is actually pledging to increase defense capabilities due to regional security concerns.
So two very different approaches, driven by, I'm guessing, very different circumstances. But it raises a bigger question. Are we heading into a more fragmented world where every nation is increasingly focused on its own security? Or are there still opportunities for collaboration?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Senegal's move might seem isolationist at first glance, but it's actually a response to a perceived lack of support from international partners. It's a reminder that security is often seen through a very local lens. And for Japan, surrounded by powerful neighbors, as they are, building up defenses is about deterring potential threats and maintaining regional stability. It's a delicate balance.
It seems like everyone's walking a tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to find that sweet spot between self-reliance and collaboration. But speaking of global issues, let's talk about the one that truly unites us, whether we like it or not, the environment. And you know what? It was actually pretty encouraging to see how much emphasis these leaders are putting on sustainability this year.
I was struck by that too. Even Saudi Arabia's crown prince, who you might not typically associate with environmental activism, let's be honest, highlighted their Vision 2030 achievements in renewable energy. It's a clear indication that the global energy landscape is shifting, and even oil-rich nations are feeling the pressure to diversify.
Okay, but is this just lip service? Or are we seeing a genuine commitment to tackling climate change? Because it's easy to make promises. It's a lot harder to actually implement them.
That's the challenge, isn't it? There's a lot of talk about green initiatives, and it's tempting to be cynical. But I do think there's a growing recognition that environmental stewardship isn't just about altruism, it's about economic survival. Countries are realizing that investing in renewable energy, sustainable practices, climate resilience, it's good for business, good for their citizens, and ultimately good for the planet.
So maybe there's hope after all. But let's not forget about the human element in all of this, behind all the economic indicators and the political posturing. There are real people whose lives are directly impacted by these decisions. What are world leaders saying about social development?
That's a crucial point. I'm glad you brought it up, because sustainable progress can't just be about GDP growth and technological advancement. It has to translate into tangible improvements in people's lives.
What stood out to you in that regard?
Well, leaders like India's Prime Minister Modi and Nigeria's President Tinubu are putting a huge focus on social development initiatives, from rural development to youth empowerment, access to credit. They're recognizing that investing in their people is essential for long-term stability and prosperity. And then you have leaders like Chile's President Boric, who's prioritizing social safety nets, increasing budgets for pensions and healthcare. These are tangible steps toward creating a more equitable society.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's a sense that amidst the challenges, there's a real commitment to building a better future, not just for nations, but for the people who live in them.
Absolutely. And that brings us to something really fascinating, the underlying ideas that are shaping these global trends. Because ultimately, it all comes down to how we perceive the world and our role in it.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dive into that in our next segment. What are the big ideas driving the global conversation in 2025?
We'll unpack that after a quick break. Stay with us. All right, so let's delve into those big ideas shaping our world in 2025. One that really resonated throughout these New Year's addresses was this concept of resilience. Leaders from such diverse backgrounds facing these very distinct challenges, from Francis Macron navigating these political divisions to Taiwan's President Lai confronting those geopolitical pressures, they all emphasize this importance of bouncing back, adapting, and even thriving in the face of adversity.
It's interesting because it goes beyond just weathering the storm, right? It's about using those challenges as opportunities for growth and transformation. Is that what you're seeing?
Precisely. Take President Putin's address, for example. While some might view his emphasis on Russia's historical resilience as mere propaganda, it taps into this deeper human need to find strength and purpose in difficult times. It's a narrative that resonates even if you disagree with his policies.
And it's not limited to, authoritarian regimes, is it? Even President Boric in Chile, with his progressive agenda, is talking about building a more resilient society, one that can withstand those economic shocks and that social upheaval. It's like this idea of resilience is becoming a global mantra.
I think you're right. It's a reflection of the times we live in, where uncertainty is the new normal. Climate change, geopolitical instability, technological disruption. These are forces that demand adaptability and a willingness to embrace change.
So resilience is one key idea. What else is shaping the global conversation?
Another significant theme, and this might surprise you, is a renewed focus on long-term thinking. Leaders seem to be recognizing that short-term gains often come at the expense of future stability.
Give me an example of that.
Well, look at the emphasis on sustainability. Yes, there's the immediate urgency of tackling climate change, but there's also this growing understanding that investing in renewable energy, green infrastructure, sustainable practices, it's a long-term strategy for economic growth and global security.
It's like finally connecting the dots, right? Realizing that the choices we make today will have repercussions for generations to come, and it's not just about the environment, is it?
Exactly. This long-term thinking is also evident in the emphasis on education, healthcare, social safety nets. These are investments in human capital, recognizing that a healthy, educated, and empowered population is essential for a thriving future.
It's interesting because it suggests a shift away from this hyper-individualistic, short-term mindset that's dominated, the past few decades. Are we seeing a return to a more collective, community-oriented approach?
Perhaps. There's certainly a growing recognition that our fates are intertwined, that these global challenges require collective solutions.
Now, you mentioned that this emphasis on long-term thinking might surprise me. Why is that?
because it seems to be emerging even in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. Take Saudi Arabia, for example. Their Vision 2030 plan, which was highlighted by the Crown Prince in his New Year's address, goes far beyond just diversifying their economy away from oil. It includes these ambitious goals for education, healthcare, tourism, even cultural development. It's a long-term vision for transforming Saudi society.
So maybe this isn't just a trend, but like a fundamental shift in thinking. And if that's the case, it has huge implications for how we approach, everything from economic policy to international relations.
Absolutely. It requires a different kind of leadership, one that's less focused on those short-term political gains and more on building a sustainable future.
Okay, so we've got resilience, long-term thinking. What else is shaping the global mindset in 2025?
Well, amidst all the talk of unity and cooperation, there's also this recognition that the world is becoming increasingly complex and interconnected. And this has led to a renewed emphasis on something crucial: critical thinking.
That's interesting. Why is critical thinking so important in this context?
Because we're bombarded with information from all directions: social media, 24-hour news cycles, competing narratives. It's easy to get overwhelmed and lose sight of what's really important. Critical thinking is about cutting through the noise, questioning those assumptions, evaluating information carefully. It's about being able to distinguish fact from fiction, signal from noise.
Especially in a world where misinformation can spread like wildfire, that skill seems more essential than ever. But how does this emphasis on critical thinking play out on a global scale? Is it something that leaders are actively promoting?
It's not always explicit, but you can see it in the way they're framing their arguments.
Mm.
They're appealing to logic and reason, presenting evidence, acknowledging different perspectives. It's a move away from those simplistic slogans and those emotional appeals.
So instead of telling people what to think, they're encouraging them to think for themselves.
Exactly. And that's a powerful shift. It suggests a recognition that in a complex world, there are rarely easy answers. We need citizens who are engaged, informed, and capable of making their own judgments.
Okay, so we've got resilience, long-term thinking, and critical thinking. These are all pretty weighty concepts. But how do they translate into concrete action? What are world leaders actually doing to put these ideas into practice?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, because it's not just about top-down pronouncements. It's about creating the conditions for these ideas to flourish.
What do you mean by that?
Take education, for example. If we want citizens who are resilient, capable of long-term thinking, and equipped with critical thinking skills, we need to invest in education systems that foster those qualities. And we're seeing that happen.
Can you give me a specific example?
Absolutely. India's Prime Minister Modi, in his New Year's address, highlighted their efforts to reform their education system, focusing on skills development, digital literacy, and critical thinking. It's a recognition that education is not just about acquiring knowledge. It's about cultivating the mindsets and skills needed to navigate a rapidly changing world.
So it's about equipping people with the tools they need to not just survive, but thrive in the 21st century.
Exactly. And it's not just about formal education. We're also seeing a growing emphasis on lifelong learning, recognizing that the skills we need to succeed are constantly evolving.
Okay, so education is one area where we're seeing these ideas translated into action. What about others?
Well, another key area is technology.
Ah, technology, the double-edged sword of the 21st century. It has the potential to solve so many problems, but it also creates new ones. How are world leaders grappling with that?
It's a delicate balance, and there's a lot of discussion about responsible innovation, ethical considerations, ensuring that technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
Okay, so there's a growing awareness of the need to harness technology for good. But are there any concrete examples of how that's playing out?
One area that's particularly interesting is the intersection of technology and sustainability.
So, using technology to address climate change and promote environmental protection.
Exactly. We're seeing significant investments in renewable energy technologies, smart grids, sustainable agriculture, and even things like carbon capture and storage.
And who's leading the charge on this front?
Well, Germany, as you might expect, continues to be a frontrunner in green technology, with Chancellor Scholz highlighting their commitment to becoming a global leader in renewable energy. But what's really fascinating is seeing countries like China and even Saudi Arabia making significant strides in this area.
So it's a global effort with different countries bringing their own strengths and expertise to the table?
Absolutely. And it's not just about government initiatives. We're also seeing a surge in private sector innovation, with companies large and small developing new technologies and business models that are both profitable and sustainable.
So it's a multi-pronged approach with governments, businesses, and even individuals playing a role in driving this technological transformation.
Precisely. And this brings us back to that idea of collective action that we talked about earlier.
Mm.
Addressing global challenges requires everyone to be on board, from world leaders to everyday citizens.
It's a reminder that we're all part of the solution. But as we talk about these big ideas and global trends, I can't help but wonder, how does this all connect back to our listeners? What does it mean for their lives, their communities, their future?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? Because it's easy to get caught up in the grand narratives of global politics and technological advancement, but ultimately it all comes down to how these trends impact people on the ground.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we make these global conversations relevant and meaningful to the everyday lives of our listeners?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in our final segment. We'll delve into the personal implications of these global trends, and we'll challenge our listeners to think about how they can participate in shaping a better future.
Okay, I'm ready to dive in. Let's connect the dots between the global and the personal. Stay with us. All right, so we've spent this deep dive exploring the grand visions and anxieties of world leaders. But now it's time to bring it all home. What does this global snapshot actually mean for you, the listener?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? Because these trends we've been talking about, resilience, long-term thinking, critical thinking, they're not just abstract concepts. They have real-world implications for how we live, work, and interact with the world around us.
So let's break it down. Resilience. We talked about it on a national level, but how does that translate to personal resilience? What does that look like in our daily lives?
It's about cultivating the ability to bounce back from setbacks, to adapt to change, to navigate uncertainty with a sense of purpose and resourcefulness. Think about the challenges you faced in your own life. Job loss, relationship issues, health problems. Those are moments that test our resilience.
And some people just seem to naturally handle those situations better than others. Is resilience something you're born with? Or is it something you can develop?
It's a bit of both, really. Some people have a natural predisposition towards resilience, but it's also a skill that can be learned and strengthened over time. It's about building your emotional intelligence, developing coping mechanisms, and cultivating a growth mindset, seeing challenges as opportunities for learning and growth.
So it's not about avoiding hardship altogether. It's about how we respond to it.
Exactly. And that's where things like mindfulness, self-care, and strong social connections come in. These were the tools that help us build our inner strength and navigate those inevitable ups and downs of life.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's move on to long-term thinking. It's easy to get so caught up in the immediacy of our daily lives to focus on what's right in front of us. How do we shift our mindset to think about the long-term consequences of our actions?
Well, it starts with recognizing that our choices today have ripple effects. They extend far beyond the present moment. Think about your financial decisions, for example. Saving for retirement might seem like a distant priority when you're young, but it has a huge impact on your future financial security.
It's like that marshmallow test they do with kids.
Right.
The ones who can delay gratification end up with a bigger reward in the end.
Exactly. And it applies to more than just finances. Think about your health, your relationships, your career choices. Are you making decisions that align with your long-term goals and values?
It's a tough question to ask ourselves, but an important one. And it leads us to the third big idea we talked about: critical thinking. We're bombarded with information from all sides, especially in this digital age. How do we develop the skills to navigate that information landscape effectively?
Well, it starts with being aware of your own biases. We all have them, and they can distort how we perceive information. Once you're aware of your biases, you can start to challenge them, to look for evidence that contradicts your assumptions.
So it's about being open to different perspectives, even if they challenge our own beliefs.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is about seeking truth, not just confirming what we already believe. It's about asking tough questions, evaluating evidence, and being willing to change our minds when presented with new information.
It sounds like a lot of work.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's also incredibly rewarding, because when you develop your critical thinking skills, you become a more informed, discerning, and empowered individual. You're less susceptible to manipulation, and you're better equipped to make decisions that align with your values and goals.
So how do we put this into practice? What's one concrete step our listeners can take today to start developing their critical thinking skills?
I would say start by questioning everything. Don't just accept information at face value, especially online.
Mm.
Ask yourself, who's the source? What's their agenda? What evidence do they have to support their claims?
It's about becoming a more active and engaged consumer of information.
Exactly, and it's a skill that will serve you well in all aspects of your life, from your personal relationships to your professional endeavors to your engagement in the wider world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the global trends of 2025, the message seems to be the world is changing and we need to change with it. We need to cultivate resilience, embrace long-term thinking, and sharpen our critical thinking skills.
And the good news is, these are all skills that we can develop and strengthen over time. It's not about being perfect. It's about being intentional. It's about making conscious choices that align with the kind of future we want to create, both for ourselves and for the world around us.
That's a great note to end on.
Hmm.
So as you go about your day, think about these trends, these ideas. How can you incorporate them into your own life? How can you use them to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead? And join us next time for another deep dive into the forces shaping our world.